Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. Do you remember the books you read as a child growing up? For the most part, they were the classics full of fun and adventure and innocence, and they usually taught a moral lesson. But I recall, even as I was coming of age in the 90s, that some books' content seemed sinister. Plots were interlaced with sexuality, curse words, and sometimes even the occult. And what of contemporary children's books? Have they evolved or devolved with respect to content? Parents would probably be somewhat shocked at what is inside their kids' books. Suffice to say, children's books have changed a lot since our days of reading Anne of Green Gables. And it doesn't just stop at swear words. Some critics are sounding the alarm over social agendas which seem to have creeped into books. Are your kids' books turning them into tiny activists, woke warriors? And remember in those ancient times, BC, before COVID, when public libraries had in-person programming for children? Recall the Drag Queen Story Hour, which had many parents up in arms, where drag queens would read books to preschoolers about topics like acceptance, bullying, and even gender ideology. Between the books being read and the drag queens reading them, there were complaints galore. So how many of us parents actually vet the books our children read? Do we assume that they are as innocent as the ones we may have read as children? How many of us even check to see what our child is actually reading or what they borrowed from their school library? And who decides the content of children's books anyhow? Who allows some of these more questionable books to be published? Well, joining me now to unpack it all is Debbie Degroff, researcher and author of Behind the Covers, What's Inside Children's Books. Thank you, Debbie, Deborah, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so this is a fascinating topic. I'm a mother of 5, so I'm always very on top of my kids to see what they're reading and make sure they're reading good stuff. And, you know, they have those Kobo readers, so they're borrowing books from the library. Sometimes, though, things, get past me, and I'm wondering, whoa, what are you reading? Is this actually a big deal today? Are there really that many more books being published that are of concern?
It's a huge deal. It's a huge deal. And so many parents, I think they're hung up on what the profanity and the sex is, but they don't realize the indoctrination. Even if you took out all of the sex and the profanity, what messages are your children getting? And, you can be attentive to your kids and be around them every second of the day. And then all of a sudden, you start seeing their worldview has totally shifted from the train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will depart from it. And you wonder, well, where in the world do they pick up an idea like that? I monitor their friends and their movies and everything like that. And parents assume that those books are safe and neutral, and they really are not. I wish I had a better message for you. I loved reading. I read all my life. Library was my favorite place. And, I don't like having to say this. I really don't.
Now, you've written a book, and I've mentioned at the beginning, on this subject matter. But what led you on this path? You're obviously a parent or a grandparent, but how did you stumble into this line of work or of writing?
Well, I never, ever wanted to write a book. I just like to teach parents what to look for so that they can guide their own children. You were mentioning before the program aired Dr. Judith Reisman. She was why I wrote this book. If you had a little Jewish lady standing in front of you that's as short as I am saying, Debbie, if you don't write it down, you're going to die with it in your head. And that's where the book started. But I actually started over 35 years ago. My first son was learning to read, and we started going to the library. It was easy to begin with to direct him because I read as a child. But of course, he was a little boy, and I would start bringing home all of the new books.
Right.
They're always back then, they were always in a special place.
Yes.
And I would just bring home an armful of them. And what I want to encourage parents, when the kids are that age and they're just learning to read, most of those books take you 20 minutes to read. You bring home a pile of those books and start making your own libraries. You say, okay, I like this one, I don't like that one, make a note of it. If you have 10 kids, the next 9 are easy, because
Debbie,
you already have your list.
I've got to cut to commercial break, but I want to hear more about what alarmed you when you were going through those library visits. Welcome back. I'm joined by Deborah Degroff, author and researcher. So before we went to break, Deborah, you were mentioning how, you'd take your kid to the library and you would see what was being published. Were there alarm bells then, 35 years ago?
I had read so much when I was little, okay? And mind you, I was in my 20s, and so it wasn't that far removed from my childhood of reading. So these were so different. And I can remember one book, and I racked my brain after all these years trying to think of the name of this book. But the little boy was fighting the evil guy who would get power over this crystal. And at the end, the boy, he caused the death of the other guy. He was in 5th grade. He was 10 years old. And he goes back to school and it's just like, pass the candy, please. And I can remember thinking, wow, no remorse, no anything, this power, this occultic thing. And I went to the librarian because she wrote an article in the paper every single week. And she had written a glowing report of this book. And I was flabbergasted. And I said, why did you write such a glowing thing? And I started telling her about it. And she says, oh, I got that from Booklist. She said, they're very reputable.
So,
and I looked
so what,
at her
is,
and I
what
thought,
is Booklist?
Booklist is a part of the American Library Association that they do book reviews.
Okay.
Okay. Now, number one, if I wrote a review in the paper with my name on it, and Booklist wrote it, you would tell me I was plagiarizing something, right?
Right, sure.
And that was the first flag. And I'm sitting here thinking, hey, you get paid to be a children's librarian and you don't even read the books and you sit here and make a review of a book you never read by copying?
So obviously you had issues, not just with the plagiaristic component of the review, but that you thought it was signed off by the local librarian, it would be okay for your kid to read. He read it. There were obviously some major issues, some red flags. And you're right, it wasn't so obvious as sexuality or swear words or easy words you can pick up. It was
because it was juvenile, okay? And in your juvenile, you usually do not get, you're not supposed to be able to have the sex and the profanity.
okay.
Okay, I've
There are
noticed over
standards.
the last few years, you get a little bit, okay? You get more of that concentrated when you get into the young adult. I have one young adult by Simon & Schuster Children's Publishing Division with over 1,300 F words.
Wow. May I ask the name of this book?
Run the Game
Run the
by
Game.
Jason Myers. And there's over 900 other choice words. And I tell everybody that's the nicest part of the book, those 2,000 words.
Wow. And this is, I assume, not a one-off. This is typical in many children's books nowadays?
That's one of the most vile that I have seen, but there are other very, very close cousins.
So
very close cousins.
So you as a parent 35 years ago started seeing some red flags. I mean, that sounds around the time when like I said, I was growing up and doing my reading, so probably around the same time. When did things, in your opinion, really start to take off? Is this something that just happened in the 90s? Was this something that started at the turn of the century, in the 20th century? When did this happen?
Okay, that's a twofold thing, because they changed the method of reading instruction across the board starting about around 1930. So when you did that, you had to switch to a controlled vocabulary because the kids couldn't sound out words anymore. They had learned to recognize words.
Right. Like
Okay.
sight words.
So you had to change the books to match that controlled vocabulary.
So prior to 1930, children were reading more like larger tomes, classics that were published.
Classic,
Okay.
yes, that's what you would have found. Now, as far as when you're talking about getting into the sex, that by 75, if not before, I have these in my book, but it was getting graphic sex scenes. Now, the only difference between that at that time was you built it up with puppy love. Okay, now there doesn't have to be any kind of relationship whatsoever.
Right.
You know, you can just meet at the mailbox, you know, and that's enough.
Right. Hookups, casual hookups.
Yes. Yes.
My goodness. So just post-sexual revolution, you started to notice things definitely were increasing in terms of sexual content within children's books. Interesting that you mentioned that there had to be an overhaul of children's reading materials, their readers, because they had to accommodate new
Yes.
learning methods within, I guess, the school system. We're going to talk a little bit more about this right when we return in a few moments.
Okay.
Welcome back. We're continuing our discussion with Deborah Degroff. We're discussing her book, Behind the Covers, What's Inside Children's Books. And Deborah, you've researched many, many books. How many children's books have you read, have you gone through?
Oh, I after 30 some years, I say there's only 7 years of my life that I haven't read children's books.
So
because I learned to read when I was 7. So honestly, yes, I've read thousands.
Thousands. So you probably have a good handle. I remember as, you know, a child having a few of these in my home, borrowing them from the library, but I always thought that the Dr. Seuss books were excellent books. They were easy to, you know, recognize words, they rhymed, they were easy to learn to read with. You know, as a mother, I maybe I'm wrong to do this, but I still use them to help my children learn to read. They're simple and colorful. Are those good books?
Good is such a relative term. Now, I have no problem with using a Dr. Seuss book if the child already knows how to read. He was hired so that kids would recognize the words to go along with the controlled vocabulary.
With the new method of reading.
Yes.
Okay, I understand.
So the Cat in the Hat had the 220 some words from the word list that I think it was Random House sent him.
Like high frequency words, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But otherwise in preschool, are there any other concerns? But like preschool books that parents might pick off from a bookshelf, might pick up from a bookshelf, or might have their child sent home from preschool or kindergarten today, or perhaps they're gifted a book, you know, at a baby shower, or they want to read something to their child every night. Are there concerns with preschool-aged books?
Yes, there are, because how many times you have 5 children? I don't know what the ages are, but when you have a preschooler and you have a book that you give that preschooler, how many times do you read it?
Oh, many.
You read it over and over and over until number 1, you have it memorized, and number 2, you want to eventually throw it in the garbage.
That's it exactly.
Right? Okay. So what happens is most of these books have an agenda in the picture books in the preschool. Number 1, they usually have the heavier pages. They're higher quality books. They have very nice illustrators, but they have an agenda. They're either the transgender or they're a political activism. But these books on activism start at birth, which is very, very interesting. You know, because you're still reading maybe Pat the Bunny or something nice to your children, and all of a sudden they're getting a political message. And when you're buying a book for a preschooler and it's teaching them how to resist and file a lawsuit,
that's actually in a book for preschoolers?
Yes, ma'am.
Which one?
Who's getting dozens and dozens and dozens? Who's getting the message? Who read the book to the child?
The parent. The parent read the book. So it's a teaching lesson that we're giving to the child, and interlaced there is an activist element, I suppose.
It is the parents are picking up the idea, whether it's environmentalism, whether it's sexuality, no matter what it is, the parents or the older adults that are reading that book to the children, they're the ones that are going to act upon that immediately.
Okay, so you're right. I definitely have noticed since, you know, I've had children across a span of a number of years, but since my eldest was born to now, the books have changed a lot. And It sounds like it's been a spectrum for a few decades, but it has changed. I noticed that, for example, when it's Earth Day in April and we celebrate sort of Earth Month, that there are a lot of books, and I wouldn't think that there would be preschooler books or toddler books where there is a lot of discussion about the environment, some very innocent, but I could understand your point that there is some influence happening through the writing. You know, when it's Gay Pride Month in June, you know, obviously all those special books get put out right at the front so people can see what we're celebrating and what's going on in society that month. And there are all sorts of books. And again, depending on your moral perspective, that may be okay, that may not be okay. Depending on how you approach your view on the environment, that may be okay, may not be okay in Earth Month. So shouldn't the parents be the arbiter? What I'm trying to say, and sorry, in 45 seconds we have left before the commercial break, is so the books get published. So what? Just parents should pick and choose. Not every parent may have the same view on the environment or sexuality or gender.
Absolutely. And that's why I call my book Between the Covers. What's inside a children's book? It's up to you. Your point of view might be different from mine. You know, this book might be lovely to you, you know, and I might have a fault with it, but I'm the one raising my children and guiding them.
Where I want to go in the next segment is I want to discuss, you know, what can parents do if they're concerned about what their kids are reading. We'll be right back in a few moments. Welcome back. We're wrapping up our discussion on what's in your children's books. And joining me is author and researcher Deborah Degroff, who actually wrote the book Behind the Covers, What's Inside Children's Books. And it's been a somewhat eye-opening discussion. I didn't realize how the evolution of children's books changed from the 1930s to now. So that's been very interesting. And obviously there are a lot of ideological inputs and influences in a lot of the kids' books nowadays. So what should parents be doing? What should they be on guard for if they have a certain worldview and want to kind of protect what their kids are reading?
Okay, well, sometimes parents will they will tell me, oh, my child knows better. Okay, other words, you know, you're going to spit that out. But I like to call this dosage. If I give your child a cupcake, that might be okay. But if I give your child 27 cupcakes, it might not be okay, right?
Right, capacity.
So what happens is if they're reading a message, okay, I mean, if they're reading a book, and let's just say the book says God is dead, okay, and say the child is a Christian, that might roll off their back. But if every book they pick up has that very same message, how many times does it take before that's normalized?
Right.
And I'm just using that as something somebody can relate to. But whether it has to do with environment, the LGBT, whatever it is, politics, capitalism, you know, whatever it is, it's all dealt with in children's books. And I'd like to say too, if anybody has looked on my website, which is what'sinsidechildrensbooks.com, you'll see that I did an article showing 161 books, children's books, about masks, okay, about mask wearing.
Like since COVID started?
Yes, the COVID, not Halloween masks, okay? And I've also did one on books about COVID. And I'd like to ask parents, and this will be a good starting point for them. When your children are little and there's awful things going on around you, are you trying to reinforce that every second of the day? Or are you trying to distract your children and make them feel safe and secure?
It's a good point. I mean, books are always considered an escape, right? A lot of people pick up a good book because they want to put their day's worries aside. A child might want to not do their homework for a bit and just escape to an imaginary world of Narnia, for example.
And yeah, and if you're sitting there and every book you're reading is about if you don't wear your mask and wash your hands the proper amount of seconds, you're going to kill grandma.
Right. Right. Yeah, no, I can appreciate that. Look, my father escaped a communist country, and I know children's books in school books were really used to hammer home certain beliefs and to really strip away cultural beliefs and things like this. So I appreciate that the written word can be used for good and for bad.
Yes. And, you know, so I encourage parents, if they start when, you know, I have 14 grandchildren, okay? You have 5 children. But if you started when you were first pregnant and you just go to the library one day and pick up 25 picture books. How long is that going to take you to read? And, go through. It doesn't matter whether you like them or you don't like them. If you found one of them that you liked, add it to your list, add it to your library, and use it through all of your children and just start building on that library. It doesn't take that long to read a kid's book. They're written on very low reading levels. And that's something we ought to close with too. How is it that kids in honors classes in high school are reading books written on a 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade reading level?
My goodness. My goodness. We have to definitely do better as an educational system. So bottom line, I mean, obviously you've got a good website for resources, but parents should just pre-read what their kids are reading?
Yes.
Everything,
yes.
every time?
In their entirety.
In their entirety.
Yes, not just picking and choosing. Well, somebody said there was a dirty word in here, or a phrase or a sex scene. They need to read the book.
Okay, Debbie, thank you so much for joining me today. It's a very eye-opening discussion, that's for sure.
And thank you for having me.
Thank you. It's interesting. So many of us are fixated on how much screen time our children get, that we think of what they're watching, what they're hearing, but we don't actually focus enough on the books that they're reading. This has been a very interesting discussion, and I know for one, I will go home and really go through my kids' books to make sure what they're taking from the library is something that I agree with, because at the end of the day, your kids are your kids, and they're your opportunity to help better the world with your values. For Counterpoint, I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.